Somewhere in a cave in Borneo, 31,000 years ago, someone held down a child while another person picked up a sharpened stone and cut through the bone of their leg. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, no idea what a nerve or an artery even was in any scientific sense. Just a decision that the only way to save this child's life was to remove part of it. The child lived, not for a few days, for years, and that single skeleton, found in a limestone cave, just rewrote everything we thought we knew about how far back real surgery goes. For decades, the story we told ourselves was simple. Surgery is a farming society invention. You need settled villages, spare time, specialists, before anyone develops the skill to cut a living human open and have them survive it. Hunter-gatherers, according to that story, were too busy chasing food to develop anything like medicine. That theory just collapsed, and it collapsed because of a single leg bone. The skeleton was discovered in 2020 in a cave called Liang Tebo in Indonesian Borneo. A young hunter-gatherer missing the lower part of their left leg and their left foot. At first, researchers assumed it was an animal attack or an accident. Bones get damaged after death all the time, and it's easy to mistake random breakage for something deliberate. But the edges of the remaining bone told a different story. They weren't jagged. They were smooth, rounded, healed. That kind of healing doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a wound has time and care to close. Using dating techniques on the surrounding sediment and the person's own teeth, researchers placed the surgery at roughly 31,000 years ago. That's not a typo. The next oldest confirmed amputation in the entire archaeological record, before this discovery, came from a 7,000-year-old French farmer. This Borneo case is more than 4 times older than that. It didn't just push the timeline back, it obliterated it. Think about what this actually required. Someone in that community understood human anatomy well enough to know where to cut without the child bleeding to death instantly. They understood that if you leave the wound open and dirty, infection kills far more efficiently than the injury itself. So somehow, whether through cauterizing the wound or covering it with something antimicrobial from the surrounding rainforest, they managed to prevent the single biggest killer in pre-modern surgery. And after the operation, someone had to carry, feed, and protect a child who could no longer walk normally through mountainous rainforest terrain for years. This wasn't one moment of desperate skill. It was sustained community care, stretched out over what researchers estimate was 6 to 9 additional years of that person's life. We don't know their name. We don't know exactly why the amputation happened. An infection, a crushing injury, a venomous bite. What we do know is that somebody in that community had already learned, tens of thousands of years before agriculture, before cities, before anything we'd call civilization, that the body could be cut into on purpose and survive. Now here's a question that should follow naturally from that. Once you can amputate a limb, what do you do about the gap it leaves behind? It turns out ancient people had already thought about that too. Around 3,000 years ago in Upper Egypt, a woman we now know as Tabagetan lost her right big toe. Researchers suspect from complications of diabetes based on the pattern of the healed stump. What she was buried with, still attached to her foot, is one of the strangest and most impressive objects in ancient medicine. A carved wooden and leather prosthetic toe, complete with a working hinge joint designed to flex the way a real toe would when she walked. This wasn't a symbolic afterlife object stitched onto a mummy for religious reasons. Modern researchers strapped replicas of this exact prosthetic onto living volunteers missing their own big toe and had them walk in reproduction ancient Egyptian sandals. The verdict? It worked. It genuinely restored a more natural walking motion. Somebody, 3,000 years ago, understood enough about gait, balance, and biomechanics to engineer a device that functioned. Not just looked the part, functioned. So amputation goes back over 31,000 years. Functional prosthetics go back 3,000. But the part of this story that might be the most unsettling isn't about limbs at all. It's about what ancient people were willing to do to a living human skull. It's called trepanation. Deliberately cutting, scraping, or drilling a hole directly into the skull of a conscious living person. And it wasn't rare, and it wasn't confined to one culture experimenting in isolation. Evidence of trepanation shows up on nearly every inhabited continent. Skulls from a Ukrainian cemetery show it being practiced more than 9,000 years ago. In northern Spain, by around 5,300 years ago, people were cutting into the skull specifically to relieve pain, using what was likely a flaked stone tool, sharp enough to function as a genuine surgical blade. But nowhere on Earth did any culture perform this operation more often or refine it further than the people of ancient Peru. Archaeologists have recovered more than 800 trepanned skulls from Peru, more than the rest of the entire world's trepanation evidence combined. And because bone actually records whether healing continued after an operation or simply stopped at the moment of death, researchers can track, skull by skull, exactly how often these patients survived across roughly 2,000 years of practice. In the earliest period researchers studied from around 400 to 200 BC, only about 40% of trepanation patients survived, meaning for every 10 people who had part of their skull removed, 6 of them died. That's a brutal, honest number. But watch what happens over time. By 1000 to 1400 AD, survival had climbed to 53%. And by the height of the Inca Empire, between 1400 and 1500 AD, survival rates in some samples reached as high as 75 to 91%. This isn't oral tradition or guesswork. This is measured directly from healed versus unhealed bone across hundreds of real skulls. Now here's the comparison that should genuinely stop you. Skull surgery performed during the American Civil War in the 1860s with metal surgical instruments, formal Western medical training, and centuries more accumulated anatomical science than the Inca ever had access to, carried a mortality rate between 46 and 56%. That means a wounded soldier undergoing skull surgery in the 1860s had roughly the same odds of dying, or worse, as a Peruvian patient did nearly 1,000 years earlier. The Inca weren't stumbling into occasional lucky outcomes. They had refined an extraordinarily dangerous procedure to a level of safety that some 19th century Western battlefield surgeons, with a several thousand-year technological head start, still hadn't matched. So how does this happen? How does a society without written science, without germ theory, without anesthesia as we understand it, outperform doctors operating with steel instruments under formal medical training? Researchers point to a few specific things Inca surgeons appear to have mastered through pure accumulated experience. First, they learned, generation after generation, precisely how deep they could cut without piercing the membrane protecting the brain itself. The same critical boundary that Hippocrates was independently identifying in ancient Greece around roughly the same era, on the opposite side of the planet. Second, their technique itself evolved. Early trepanations often involved crude scraping across a wide area of bone. Later, Inca surgeons specialized in a precise circular grooving method, scoring a clean outline and lifting out a single tidy plug of bone, minimizing the trauma to surrounding tissue. And third, something about their overall approach controlled infection, even though the exact mechanism remains unknown to researchers today. No sterilization procedure as we would define one, no antibiotics. And yet the recorded infection rates on these skulls are remarkably, consistently low. There's a detail buried in the research that's easy to skip past, and shouldn't be. A substantial number of Peruvian patients had more than one trepanation hole in their skull. Some had 2, some as many as 7. That means people were surviving this operation, healing from it, and then, at some point, undergoing it again. You don't return voluntarily for a second brain surgery performed with a stone tool unless the first one actually worked. Put these 3 discoveries together: a child in Borneo surviving a full limb amputation 31,000 years ago, a woman in Egypt walking on an engineered wooden toe 3,000 years ago, and Inca surgeons in Peru achieving skull surgery survival rates that outperformed the American Civil War by centuries, and a very different picture of our ancestors starts to take shape. Not primitive people stumbling blindly through injury and infection, patiently waiting for modern medicine to eventually arrive and rescue them. People who, independently on entirely different continents, separated by tens of thousands of years and zero communication with each other, kept arriving at the same conclusion through nothing but observation, trial, failure, and refinement. Sometimes the only way to save a life is to cut it open first, and if you do it carefully enough and learn